Hi, everyone. Welcome to another week of the Midrash on the Parashah with Rabbi Dr. Sam Lebens. We've done this a couple times already, so I'll just go really quickly. As usual, please put questions in the chat or raise your hand. You're welcome to accept an invitation to be a panelist, but please stay muted when you are not speaking. And yeah, I think we can just jump right in. Thank you so much.
Great. Lovely to be here with you today. So I have given a handout to Chaya. She might be able to share it again with you, good people. Somewhat boringly, I don't like it when people do this too often. I want to start with the first verse of the Parashah. The reason I don't like doing it so often is because everybody gives a Dvar Torah every Shabbos about the first week of the Parashah, the first verse of the Parashah, and you want to push a bit forward. But my hope is that doing so later on will give us a really interesting midrashic lens for viewing another episode in this week's Parashah. So without further ado, let's just get the first verse of the Parashah in our minds. It's Vayera elav Hashem be'elonei mamrei v'hu yoshev petach ha'oel k'chol mayom. So the Lord appeared in the plains of Mamre, which is it's the name of a place, or the terebinths of Mamre, as it's translated here, which refers to trees. And there is an argument among the rabbis how to translate this particular word, Elonei, whether it's referring to some sort of tree, whether it's referring to some sort of topology, so like the plains of Mamre. And he is referring to Abraham. Abraham was sitting at the entrance of the tent as the day grew hot. And you can gather from the context, this is just after he's circumcised himself, okay? So one thing I wanted to share with you is a midrash I discovered only this week. And it's a midrash which brings in to focus our first verse, but it's actually a midrash on Parashat Lech Lecha. It's a midrash that's on last week's Parashah. I don't know if any of you've noticed, but Avraham has a number of people surrounding him, as well as his wife Sarah and Hagar and Ishmael, and his, the growing family. First of all, at the beginning of Parashat Lech Lecha, it's described that Avram and Sarai, as they were then called, had created souls in Haran. Means that something like they had generated a following and their followers came with them. And when Abraham goes to fight against the kings, the four kings in last week's Parashah, there's this big war and Abraham takes part to save his captive nephew. He takes lots of his indentured men with him. So he's got people who work for him. He's got herdsmen, he's got slaves or servants, a whole big group of people, he's got followers. But there are three named individuals who are called his Ba'alei Brit, which means his allies. And so they're not people he owned or he ruled over. They're more like equals. And they're named Aner, Eshkol, and Mamre. And just last week, just this Shabbat, yesterday, I started to get really curious. Who are these three people? We don't hear about them ever again, really. Aner, Eshkol, and Mamre, the Ba'alei Brit of Avram Avinu. And I looked into it. According to one reading, all three of them got circumcised alongside Abraham because they believed in his God. And in fact, the town of Hebron is also called Kiryat Arba, which means the town of four. And according to one midrash, it's called the town of four because four great people lived there: Avraham, Mamre, Aner, and Eshkol. Avraham and his three musketeers, which is, a nice thought. But there's another midrashic tradition that says, no. They were all great, and you'll see, I think they were all great. Abraham's friends, Mamre, Eshkol, and Aner. But one of them was much better than the others. And it's not the case that they all got circumcised. If any of them did, apart from Abraham, it would have been Mamre. Why? So let's look at the first midrash on our handout. It's from Genesis Rabbah, chapter 42, midrash 8. So first of all, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nehemiah have an argument about this word. I told you there was an argument about this word, alonei, in the phrase alonei mamre, like the plains of Mamre, or the tree of Mamre, or whatever. So Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nehemiah have an argument about the meaning of that word. Rabbi Yehuda Amar b'mishriya de Mamre, which means in the flat lands of Mamre, right, the plains of Mamre. Rabbi Nehemiah Amar b'falatin de Mamre, it was in Mamre's palace, which is strange that Abraham would have pitched his tent inside the palace of Mamre. So maybe we have to imagine it's more like in the grounds of Mamre, right? Mamre's own private property. That's just a suggestion. Otherwise, I don't really know what to make of Rabbi Nehemiah. And then it goes, Al dati de Rabbi Yehuda, atrahu dishmei Mamre. Sure, we know that there's a person called Mamre, but then because there was a person called Mamre, there was then a city called Mamre. And then the plains around the city got to be known as the plains of Mamre, not because they belonged to Mamre, not because it's just, it's kind of like very derivative or very diluted reference to the person Mamre. It's a city that's named after a person, and then there are these plains which are named after the city, and it's just this place called Mamre. Like don't connect it too deeply to Mamre. It's not like his private property. That's Rabbi Yehuda's reading. Al-Dati, Rabbi Nehemiah, Gavrahu Dishmei Mamre. No, it's talking about the man Mamre, and this is his palace. Alonei Mamre, the palace of the person. V'lama nikra shmo Mamre. Why was he called Mamre? Rabbi Azariah b'shem Rabbi Yehuda b'shem Rabbi Simon. So there's a suggestion here put forward by Rabbi Azariah in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, in the name of Rabbi Simon. Shehimra panim ba'Avraham, which means something like He'iz panim ba'Avraham, which means something like he kind of stood up brazenly to Avraham. So Mamre is called Mamre because of his brazenness. He stood up brazenly to Avraham. How do we know that? Well, here's a story. At the moment when the Holy One, blessed be He, told Avraham to circumcise himself, halach v'nimlach b'shloshet ohava. Avraham went to discuss the suggestion with his three musketeers. I'm calling them his three musketeers. So he goes to discuss the suggestion with his three confidants, his three best friends, Aner, Mamre, and Eshkol. And then what happens? Well, he gets conflicting advice, as we'll see. Amalo Aner. Aner said to him, Kfar ben me'ashanata. You're already 100 years old. You're going to go and harm yourself. Like you're not in a good health position to be doing this to be doing this operation to yourself right now. You're 100 years old. Now, on the one hand, Aner here comes off like as a man of little faith in God. But I do want to point out that Aner seems to have Abraham's best interests at heart. Aner's saying, look, Abraham, I care about you, Abraham. You're 100 years old. Don't do this. It's only going to be bad, right? Will you heal? Will you get infected? Will you die? Just don't do it. Amaro Eshkol. Eshkol says to him, Ma atolechu mesayim et atzmecha bein sonecha, which literally means, and I've seen the commentaries on the Midrash, there are various different suggestions as to whether there was a scribal error here, but literally it means something like this. What are you going to go and finish yourself between your enemies? But according to all the commentaries, however they resolve what they take to be a potential scribal error here, is the following suggestion. Look, you've just been at war with 4 kings. You've got plenty of enemies around with unsettled business against you. This is not the time to undergo a medical operation that will render you, inactive for a certain amount of time, right? So this will be as good as, sealing your fate among your enemies. Don't do it. So Eshkol, like Aner, seems to have Abraham's best interests at heart. And they think that it's a foolish idea to circumcise himself. But then, of course, he goes to Mamre. Amalon Mamre Elohecha, she'amad lecha b'kivshan ha'esh, u'v'melachim u'v're'evon. Your God, who stood you up in the fiery furnace. And this is a reference to a very central midrashic tradition about Abraham, that in his youth he was put into a fiery furnace by Nimrod because of his monotheism, and he survived, miraculously survived being thrust into a fiery furnace. So Mamre says to him, drawing from that midrash, he says, Abraham, I've read the midrashim and I know that you survived through a fiery furnace, and your God did that for you. And I've seen, we went to battle against these four massive world powers and you won, again, miraculously. And you've survived the famine and the years of hardship. Are you seriously not going to listen to this God who tells you to circumcise yourself? Like, yeah, it's a risky thing to do, but this God of yours has had your back in so many different situations that you really should, you really should trust him. And then Amalek HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God is very happy with Mamre, as you can imagine. And God says to Mamre, Ata natata lo eitza lamu. You gave him advice to circumcise. Chayecha she'eni nigle alav lo b'palatin shel aner v'lo b'palatin shel eshkol ela b'palatin shel cha. I am not going to appear to Abraham in the palace of Aner, and I'm not going to appear to Abraham in the palace of Eshkol. I will only ever appear to Abraham in the palace of Mamre, as it says in the first verse of this week's Parashah, Vayera elav Hashem ba'alonei Mamre. I loved this midrash that I discovered only, like I said, only yesterday. Why do I love it so much? I'll try and explain. So, first of all, you know, it's interesting because it's good fan fiction, because you've got three names here, Aner, Eshkol, and Mamre, and we know nothing about them. We never hear about them again. But we're told they're the ballet Brit of Abraham. So you feel like the need for some more narrative, and the Midrash steps up and gives you it, and that's cool. But I think also it addresses, as so often these stories do, a really interesting question that's got nothing to do with, why did God appear to him in Alonei Mamre, and what does Alonei really mean? Those are kind of pegs upon which the Midrash is built. But there is a deep issue that's being dealt with in this Midrash, it seems to me. And the question is this: how do you know if God speaks to you that it's really God? Right? Because look, Abraham here, you know, Mamre gets praised in this Midrash for giving Abraham the right advice. But shouldn't we ask, like, why is Abraham even seeking advice? If God tells you to do something, you do it. In the Bible, it doesn't say that Abraham doubted the command. In the Bible, it doesn't say Abraham hesitated. The Bible says Abraham does what he's told, and he gets himself circumcised. So why is the Midrash making up this whole story in which it looks like Abraham's doubting whether or not did he really hear God's voice? Is this really a good idea? Well, okay, so you could read it in a number of ways. On one reading, Abraham doesn't doubt that it was God. He's just wondering whether this is a good idea, right? You know, God told me to do something, Anna, should I do it? And Anna says, no, it's a silly idea. God told me to do something, Eshkol, should I do it? No, it's a silly idea. God told me to do something, Mamre, should I do it? And Mamre's like, yeah, of course you should, it's God, right? That's one reading. But I think a kind of more interesting reading is, if Abraham could be sure it really was God, he wouldn't be asking the question. If you hear voices speaking in your head, is this a sign of mental ill health, or is this real communication from God? It's interesting. Sa'adya Gaon in his magnum opus, he was a great rabbinic philosopher in the 10th century. His magnum opus is called Emunot V'Dayot, the Book of Opinions and Beliefs. He worries about this too. How should a prophet know that they're not insane? And he gives certain answers. He says, actually, when a vision comes to a prophet, like if a prophet sees a fiery angel or something, the prophet can ask their friends, do you see that too? And only if they see it too, they might not be able to hear it, but they should at least be able to see it. If they can see it too, then he can rest assured that he or she is not mentally ill. This is a real prophecy. That's an epistemic procedure called cross-checking. When you have an experience and you're not sure whether it's real or not, you ask someone else, oh, do you see that too? It's cross-checking. So Sajja Gaon says that God allows the prophets to cross-check. Well, this midrash makes it look like Abraham is cross-checking too. Not that like, did you hear the voice as well, Aner? Did you hear the voice as well, Eshkol? Did you hear it too, Mamre? No, only Abraham heard it. But Abraham's worried. You know, is this the signs of, I'm 100 years old, is this the signs of senility? Or is God actually speaking to me? And Aner and Eshkol are not portrayed in a bad light, neither is Abraham. It seems like the Midrash thinks it's a fair thing for Abraham to worry about. And Aner and Eshkol say, look, it is a fair thing to worry about. You're 100 years old. This could kill you, and you've got many enemies, right? But Mamre addresses head on the question that Abraham has, which is, how can I know if I'm really a prophet or whether I'm just hearing voices? And Mamre says, look, Abraham, you've got plenty of external evidence. Right, this is a reliable mechanism, this prophecy thing of yours, because it got you out of a fiery furnace. It allowed you to win a world war. You've survived inclement situations like the Great Famine in ways that we wouldn't necessarily have expected you to. And because of these external pieces of evidence, Mamre tells Abraham, you can rest assured this is something you can rely on, this voice hearing of yours. You know, other people hear voices, might need to go and see a local psychiatrist. But in this particular case, I'm telling you, it's reliable. So I think it's a lovely midrash because it's a nice example of a midrash doing multiple things at once. There's that element that I call fan fiction, of filling in what seems like an obvious gap. We want to know more about these people, Mamre, Eshkol, Aner. They're named but not described. And it's almost like a lacuna into which the rabbinic imagination just has to go. But also, it's a nice example of a midrash that is probably, or at least plausibly read as addressing a deep theological philosophical puzzle to do with the reliability of prophecy and how a prophet can know that he or she is a prophet. So even if it's not this midrash, a particularly revelatory explanation of the word Elonei Mamre, and even if it's not a reliable account of who Mamre really was and what really happened, it's a fascinating study into the reliability of prophecy, and when should you trust the voices in your head, and you know, and when's it legitimate to ask questions about it. Anyway, that really was a tangent. I discovered that midrash yesterday, wanted to share it with you, thought it was fun, and it's based on the opening verse of our parasha, as I said. I want to think about something else in the opening verse of our parasha. Abraham is sitting at the entrance of his tent in the opening of our parasha. And it's at the opening of his tent that he sees these three guests appear, who later turn out to be angels, harbingers of the good tidings that Sarah is going to conceive this time next year. But the opening of Abraham's tent takes on kind of mythic proportions in the midrashic imagination. There's a very well-known Rashi on the first pasuk of this week's parasha that says that Abraham was sitting there in the heat of the day, in the opening of his tent, despite the pain of his recovery from the circumcision, which was only days earlier, in order to see whether anyone passed by, because he wanted to seize the opportunity to invite people into his home. So he's kind of sitting there always by the door of his house in hope that passers-by may be available such that he can exercise his hospitality. Rashi is presumably there drawing from the next midrash on our handout, also Parashah Hashavuah 48, which starts at 48, paragraph 9, which starts with this phrase: Petach ha'ohel, the opening of Avram's tent. It's just, I think this is so beautiful. It says, Petach tov petachta la'ovrim v'l'shavim. Petach tov petachta l'geirim. You opened a great opening for passers-by. You opened a great opening for strangers. She'ilu le'at, if it hadn't been for you, and presumably if it hadn't been for you and this behavior of yours, of opening your tent to create a good opening for passers-by, a good opening for strangers, had it not been for that, lo verati shemaim va'aretz, I wouldn't have created the world. Shne'emar vayimtachem ka'ohel l'shaveh. In the book of Isaiah, when God's creation of the world is described, it's described as him stretching out the skies like a tent to dwell in. And the Midrash says Isaiah's description of the creation is alluding to Abraham's tent. Why? Because God only wanted to make a world so that it could host a tent like Abraham's. God praises the opening of Abraham's tent because it's this opening that allows him to see and to care for passers-by. His tent isn't closed to the world. He's eager to bring people in. Moreover, God's creation of the world, as we've seen, right, it's likened to God stretching out a tent. And this is in order to let us know that really the entire universe was only created so as to make possible the tent that Abraham would one day build. It's not so much that the world is a blueprint for Abraham's tent, but it's that Abraham's tent and its good opening is a blueprint for the world. Right? Had it not been for you, I wouldn't have created it. Later on, the Midrash continues, and this is, I cut out quite a big portion of the paragraph. There's then a discussion about, so to speak, the architecture of Abraham's tent. Amar Rabbi Abahu, Ohel plan shel Avinu Abraham mufulash haya, which means Abraham's tent was a dissected gateway. That means it was like, his tent was like one big corridor because it was open on two sides. That's the idea. It had an entrance on both sides. And then Rabbi Yudan says, no, that's not right. Second, where is the handout? Rabbi Yudan Amar, kahaden dormilos. It's like these things called the dormilos, which is some sort of double-gated passageway, i.e., it was a room with an entrance on two sides. Amar, imani ro'eh otan shehifligu et darakam lihitkarev derech tan ani yodea she'ein baim etzli kevan shera oton shehifligu miyad v'yaratz likratam mipetach ha'ohel v'yishtachavu arza. If I see them wandering in my direction, I'll know they're coming to me. That's to say, because I've got two doorways, I'm not going to miss anyone. As soon as he saw people wandering in his direction, he'd immediately run to greet them from the opening of his tent and bow to them. So what I'm trying to point out so far is that the Torah tells us his tent has one opening and he's sitting at it. The Midrash says that it doesn't just have one opening, it has two openings, right? Because that's how eager Abraham was to not to miss any potential for hospitality. So it didn't just have the one opening described in the Bible, it actually had two openings, right? Then later on, the rabbis imagine that Abraham, when he builds, okay, so later on in Sefer Bereshit, he plants a tree called an eshel, which is often translated as a tamarisk. So it's a tamarisk tree that he plants. But according to one reading, no, it wasn't a tree. It was another tent he pitched. And this tent was like a hotel. It was an inn. So I want you to pay attention. We're no longer talking about the tent that he lives in. It's a tent that he built later on in the book of Genesis. And he built it as something like a hotel. And about that tent, his second tent, his hotel tent, there's a beautiful further midrash that I wanted to share with you, no longer from Midrash Rabbah, but from Midrash Tehillim, Oh, it says on the handout Midrash Rabbah 110. That's wrong. It's Midrash Tehillim 110, which is the book of midrashim on the book of Psalms, and this is on the 110th Psalm. It says, Yeshenim hayu umot ha'akum. The nations of the world were as if asleep. Melavot tachat kanfei hashchina, failing to take shelter beneath the wings of the divine presence. Umi ha'iran lavo lachasot tachat kanfei hashchina. Who was it who awakened them, awakened the non-Jews to come and to take shelter, under the wings of the divine presence? Abraham. It was Abraham. Shnema mi he'ir mimizrach, as it says. Abraham, who was it who wakened people up in the east? Ba'alto malazah bilvad ela af hadstaka haita yeshena ve'ira Abraham. And it wasn't just, I suppose, their theism that he awakened. Abraham also awakened the notion of charity. The Ketzad Asa Abraham. How did Abraham do this? Asalo pundak. He made an inn. Upetach lo ptachim lekol ruach. He made sure that it was open on all sides. So that's 4 openings, not 2. Okay. V'haya makabel ha'ovrim v'shavim, and by having these 4 openings to his tent, he really wouldn't miss anybody, and he would be able to welcome in passers-by. Shnema, as it says in Genesis 21:33, Vayita eshel bever sheva, which literally means Abraham planted a tamarisk in the town of Beersheba. But Amar Rabbi Azariah, what does eshel really mean? Eshel is an acronym for achila, shtia, and levia. It's an acronym for eating, drinking, and escorting one's guests. And actually, in modern Hebrew, the word eshel still does mean that. It's achila, shtia, and linat. So eating, drinking, and sleeping. So if you're paying full board at a hotel, it can sometimes be charged to your account as eshel, right? Achila, shtia, and lina. So that comes from this midrash. Now we know Abraham didn't plant a tree; he built an inn, and of course, it was open on all 4 sides. Now, if his inn was open on all 4 sides, then surely his tent shouldn't be open only on 2 sides, right? You wouldn't want his home to be less ideal than his hotel, so his home should be open on all 4 sides as well. And that's actually what we find, not in the midrash per se. We need to go to later sources. We need to go to as far as medieval times. But you see, or I didn't make it bold, the title, but just after what I wrongly titled Midrash Rabbah 110, which was supposed to be Midrash Tehillim 110, there's a Mishnah from Masechet Avot, chapter 1, Mishnah 5, which says the following: Yossi ben Yochanan ish Yerushalayim omer yihi beitecha patuach liravacha. Yossi ben Yochanan, the man of Jerusalem, said, "You should make your house wide open." And he carries on to say, so that 4 people should be welcome in and whatever. I want to show you the commentary to this Mishnah by Rabbeinu Yonah. Rabbeinu Yonah was a medieval commentator and Talmid Chacham from Gerona. He was a student of Nachmanides, a fierce critic in his youth of Maimonides, and then he spent much of the last few years of his life trying to emigrate to Israel, specifically to apologize at the grave of Maimonides for the fervor with which he had been anti-Maimonidean in his youth. A fabulous individual, and he has a commentary on Pirkei Avot, and this is what he says. What does it mean your house should be wide open? Avram Avinu, your house should be like the house of Abraham, shalom, may peace be upon him. Because he made sure to put his house on the road in a tight spot. Kedei sheyichnesu l'sham ha'ovrim v'hashavim, so that passers-by would enter into there. V'yiyeh beito patuach la'arba ruchot, and it would be that his house was open on all four sides, b'kol tzad, on every side. She'yavo she'yimtzeu petach patuach v'yifnu l'sham, so no one should ever find a closed door. This is beautiful. It's not just so that Abraham would be able to see when people are coming. So nobody should arrive at your house to find a door that's closed in their face. The opening of the tents should always be open. So what I've been trying to trace with you is our Parashah starts with Abraham sitting at the entrance of his tent. The verse makes it seem as if there's just one entrance. But the Midrash comes along and says, no, there were two entrances. Then Rabbeinu Yonah built upon these traditions and assumed that no, there must have been four openings in Abraham's home, since his house wouldn't have been any less virtuous than his inn. So poor old Abraham, right? His tent keeps on losing walls. It started off with one door in the Pshat of the Bible, and now it's got four. Moreover, we've been told that this scene of Abraham sitting in his tent wide open in all directions, so that nobody should have a door closed in their face, it has a cosmic significance, since the entire world was created in virtue of Abraham's tent and its opening or openings. Right, so that's what I wanted to show you. That's kind of act one of this piece. Now, not for nothing did the rabbis make a big deal of Abraham's tent here at the beginning of this parsha, because, as so often is the case, the rabbis, even in their biggest flights of fancy, are sensitive to subtle details in the text. Right? The Torah itself draws a contrast between Abraham's tent and Abraham's hospitality on the one hand, and Lot, that's his nephew, and his nephew's tent, and his nephew's hospitality on the other. Because two of the three guests who stay with Abraham travel onwards to Sodom and Gomorrah to destroy those cities. But before they do so, they take hospitality with Lot, the nephew of Abraham. So there's a narrative comparison between these two homes, the home of Abraham and the home of Lot. And we're told Abraham sits at the tent, at the opening of his tent. And the rabbis have made a very, very big deal of this scene. Okay. But what we're going to see is it's the Torah's own comparison between these tents. It's going to become apparent that there's something to treasure about the design plan of Avram's tent. In other words, right, the rabbis are accentuating a theme that's easy to miss, but it's actually deeply rooted in the text and in the story of our Parashah. Okay, so as I've told you, it's after the three guests have received their hospitality with Avram, two of them proceed on to Sodom. And they're on a mission to destroy the city. Now, I haven't put these sources in the handout, but if you have to hand, you can open a Chumash or a Tanakh if you like to chapter 19, verses 1 and onwards, the beginning of chapter 19. So it's the beginning of chapter 18. We have Abraham sitting outside his tent. And the beginning of chapter 19, we have the two angels arriving in Sodom. So I'll just read the English. The two angels arrived in Sodom in the evening, as Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. Note, by the way, he's not sitting at the gate of his house like Abraham was. He's sitting at the gate of his city. Well, that might just be because Abraham doesn't live in a city. He lives in the wilderness, and Lot lives in a city. But mark that difference first of all. When Lot saw them, he rose to greet them, and bowing low with his face to the ground, he said, "Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house to spend the night and bathe your feet. Then you may be on your way early." Very nice, hospitable, gracious host, very Abrahamic. Now, notice, though, that the guests are already described in the very first verse as angels. The two angels arrived in Sodom in the evening. When they arrive at the tent of Abraham, they're described as three men. Okay, or messengers. I saw Jennifer mouth. That's right, messengers. But they're not described as angels. They're described. Well, actually, angels is a synonym of messengers. No, in 18 they're described as men. In 19 they're described as angels or messengers. So I want you to note that difference too. So Abraham sits at the entrance to his tent, whereas Lot sits at the entrance of the city. There's this slight difference between are they men or are they angels, but in all other respects, their behavior seems identical. Basically, they're both people who sit in wait for the opportunity to offer hospitality. Let's carry on with the verses in chapter 19. But they, the angels, they said, no, we will spend the night in the square. And yet he urged them strongly. So they turned his way and entered his house. He prepared a feast for them and baked unleavened bread. The midrashim have a field day with that and suggest it was Pesach because he gave them matzah, and that Lot was keeping the mitzvot that he learnt in the house of Abraham. And they ate. Again, so far, so Abrahamic. But the story continues. And this is where it takes a disturbing turn. Okay? So again, I'm reading from the narrative in English. They had not yet laid down for the night when the townspeople, the people of Sodom, young and old, all the people to the last, gathered about the house, and they shouted to Lot and said to him, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them. The suggestion there is that they want to know them carnally. So Lot went out to them, to the entrance. He shut the door behind himself, and he said, I beg you, my friends, do not commit such a wrong. So Sodom is a town that God has already condemned for destruction. It's a town that has no community of righteous people within it because God's told that to Abraham. Abraham's tried to argue on its case, are there a number of righteous people, and the number keeps changing as he barters with God. But there's no one righteous in this town. Abraham's home is different to the home of Lot because Abraham doesn't live in a rough neighborhood. Right? So consequently, Abraham's tent has a petach. Lot's home, by contrast, has an opening, has a petach. But it also has what is called in Hebrew a delet, a door. Lot can close the opening to his tent by way of his door. Okay. And this is the first time that the word door has appeared in the Torah, delet. Now, the rabbis, and we're going to see this again in our Midrash next week in Parashat Hashavuah. The rabbis tend to regard the first appearance of a word in the Torah as presenting a paradigm case. So, for example, the first time that the word love appears in the Torah is supposed to present us with a paradigm case of love. That's actually the love that Abraham has for Yitzchak, parental love. The first time that justice appears in the Torah is supposed to present us with a paradigm case of justice, and so on and so forth. So here in Sodom, we have the paradigm case of a door, right? As if to affirm this rabbinic notion that the first time a word appears is significant. The word door, it actually echoes throughout this part of the story. It's repeated almost incessantly. In the space of 4 verses, the word appears 3 times. Delet, as Lot shuts himself out of his house to speak to the mob. Delet, as the mob attempt to break it down. Delet, as the angels strike the mob with blindness, they bring Lot inside and they shut the door behind him. So this was all put to me, the centrality of the door in this narrative was put to me by one of my formidable teachers, Rav Shmuel Nachum. And he said to me in his inimitable way, the entire story seems to hinge upon the hinges of that door. Right? The door is a central character. So Abraham's house is open. He's got 1 petach, 2 tachim, 4. It doesn't matter. It's open, and he sits in the opening. Lot's house is closed, but that's not Lot's fault, right? Lot has to have a door, and his door serves a reasonable function, because he lives in Sodom. It's there to protect him and his family and his guests, and we really see the need for a door. But this defense of Lot, let him off the hook. He needed to have a door. He lived in a tough neighborhood. It collapses, that defense collapses as we hear what he says next to the mob, right? Because he addresses them, and this is what he says. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you may do to them as you please. But do not do anything to these men, since they have come under the shelter of my roof. It's just astonishing. Lot wants to save his guests, and so he offers his virgin daughters to would-be rapists outside. Look, it's a horrendous situation to be in, right? Because they're baying for blood. They want to rape the male guests. It's a horrific situation, but it's also a horrendous offer. Do whatever you want to them. It leads us to wonder, first of all, why is this a person worthy of being saved and stoned? But it also, I think, it leads us to think about his door, because you might think it justified to erect a door in order to protect those closest to you from the dangers outside, and surely it is. And yet the first owner of a door in the Bible doesn't seem to care about the people closest to him. So what's going on? Did he build this door to protect the people who live inside his home? Or did he build the door because he didn't care about the people outside of it? In fact, if you don't care about the people outside of your home, perhaps that's an indication that you won't really care about the people inside of it either, because you'll be self-centered. So Lot finds himself undoubtedly in a tight spot, and we see that he's willing to sell out his nearest and dearest in order to save face. Now, these are honorable guests. He calls them my lords, right? And he's their host. He's the host of nobility. So he has a status to protect. In fact, we've already said he noticed that they were angels, right? Which is something that Abraham didn't notice. And in order to protect his status as the host of nobility, he's willing to hand over his own daughters, right? So Lot really doesn't seem to care for much apart from himself and his status. So Abraham's sitting by his entrance to his tent, and he's there because he's on the lookout for guests. And superficially, it looks like Lot seems to have adopted a similar practice. But he wasn't sitting outside his tent. He was sitting at the gate of the city, which is where prestigious people sit. It's where the judges and the rulers would sit in ancient times. So you're forced to ask, was he really on the lookout for guests, or was he on the lookout for himself? Would he have invited passers-by home, or only those worthy of being called my lords? Only those that Lot could see were angelic? Would he have invited them had he only seen people like Abraham saw? Again, all of this should lead us to question why his front door was really there, to shut people in or to shut people out. And since he's willing to eject his nearest and dearest from the safety of his home, we're forced to conclude that Lot's real reason for having a door is primarily to distance himself from undesirable others. I'm just going to look at the chat, because a lot of things have come up, mainly to do with the handout. Delet, says Jennifer, in Safari definitions, connections are multiple. A door once closed is permanent. Revolving door, the womb as a door. So a permanent houses like gates of the city, revolving doors function to let people in or out. Yeah, so the question is, are doors there for the safety of the people inside, or to keep people on the outside? So the last source I wanted to share with you is not a midrash, but it's of the same period. It's a Gemara. And this was a Gemara that I once recorded a podcast with Dr. Steinmetz for Drisha about this door, and I introduced the midrash that we've looked at, the midrash. Oh no, I didn't introduce the midrashim about Abraham. I just introduced the verses from this week's Parashah about Lot and the door, and Dr. Steinmetz introduced this Gemara. Okay, the Gemara is commenting on a Mishnah. Let me tell you just quickly what's happening in the Mishnah. the Mishnah discusses a housing association and whether it is permitted to compel its residents to pay for the construction of a gatehouse. Okay, so you've got multiple homes in one plot of land. Can the housing association force you to pay your fair share of the construction costs for a gatehouse? And the Mishnah says, yes, you're allowed to do that. The Talmud, however, is worried. It registers some surprise at this ruling, and it does so in terms of a story. Okay, so let's have a look at the story. Can you really say that making a gatehouse is a good thing? There was once a pious man with whom Elijah the prophet, because Elijah the prophet never really died, of course, he ascended to heaven in a fiery chariot. And sometimes Elijah comes down to earth to hang out with the righteous, right? So there was once a righteous man with whom Elijah was familiar, and Elijah would come and hang out with him from time to time. Avad beit sha'ar v'tu lo mishtay b'hadei. But as soon as that righteous man built a gatehouse to his property, Elijah stopped appearing. So the Talmud says, how can the Mishnah say you're allowed to force people to you're allowed to force people to build a gatehouse when gatehouse is a bad news, right? If you're a righteous person and Elijah likes to hang out with you and you build a gatehouse, Elijah's not going to come back anymore. Righteous people like Abraham don't want doors. To build a door is to sacrifice your piety. So the Talmud wants to know, how can a housing association have the right to force a person to be less pious? And the Talmud offers a number of possible solutions. You can see in the source there. It says, perhaps the Mishnah is talking about a gatehouse that's on the inside of a courtyard, and that would allow poor people, strangers, passers-by onto the premises, right? They'd be able to get in, but they just wouldn't be able to get into people's private places. They'd be able to get into the quad. Fine. Another suggestion, perhaps the pious person built a gatehouse Perhaps the pious person built his gatehouse on the outside, not even allowing people into his courtyard, and that was what was wrong, right? This is the Talmud trying to reconcile the Mishnah in the story. Alternatively, the Gemara suggests maybe the Mishnah is only talking about a gatehouse that doesn't have a door. You could have, it's like a checkpoint. You have to come in and register your name or something, but there's no door there. So even if strangers have to pass through it, they'd always be heard on the inside. It's not like they're being shut out forcibly. And therefore, the suggestion seemingly of the Talmud, if we're trying to reconcile the story and the Mishnah, it's perhaps the pious person built a gatehouse with a door in it, not just a checkpoint. And that's why Elijah got upset. Finally, the Talmud suggests, well, perhaps the Mishnah, it is talking about a gatehouse, and it is talking about a gatehouse with a door, but only a door that can be opened from the outside, right? So there are some doors that can't even be opened from the outside. They can only be opened from the inside. And perhaps the pious person, by contrast, he didn't just build a gatehouse. He didn't just build a gatehouse with a door, but he built a gatehouse with a door that could only be opened from within. Perhaps that's why Elijah got upset. So to put it into context, we've started out with a conflict between the Mishnah, which allows us to compel people to build gatehouses, and a story about a pious man whose gatehouse upset Elijah. And the suggestion is, surely we can't force people to be impious. Right? So in a series of attempts at reconciling this conflict, the Talmud first suggests that Elijah doesn't like gatehouses on the perimeter of a property. Then it suggests that, maybe God's okay with that, but only there's a door in it. And then he suggests that God's okay with that too, so long as the door can be opened from the outside. By the end, it seems as if you can build a fortress around yourself, so long as there's something like a doorbell there. In other words, I would suggest that the Gemara is recognizing that sometimes doors are necessary. right? Sometimes even fortresses are necessary. But we do have to protect our privacy. We have to protect our loved ones, right? We have and we have a right to that. We have a right to protect our possessions, right? So if you're living in shared accommodation, you're living in a block of apartments, for example, you are allowed to compel, other residents in your block to contribute to the construction of a door. Doors are sometimes necessary, but it seems that they should always be viewed as a necessary evil. You should never forget that the door was an invention of Sodom. That's the thing. Where perhaps we've gone further than the podcast that I recorded with Dr. Steinmetz is that the Midrash about Abraham sitting outside his tent is now much more central to the story, to one of the themes of this parsha, to one of the, it's not just, oh, the first verse, Abraham's sitting at his tent, isn't that nice? Abraham likes to see guests. There's a fundamental contrast that we need to be sensitive to. Don't forget about Abraham and his tent and its opening when you come to read about Lot and its door and what that door signifies, right? God built the world because of the image of Abraham's open tent, whereas doors, they come from Sodom, right? So in other words, it's not incidental that the Midrash wants to emphasize and exaggerate the open quality of Abraham's tent, right? My suggestion is that perhaps the Midrash is doing this in light of this tacit comparison, the comparison made by the Torah itself between the open tent of Abraham and Lot's invention of a door. And it's an interesting question. I mean, I'll end on a personal note. Years and years ago, when I was a graduate student and newly married, and we lived in a one-bedroom apartment, we didn't have any kids. My wife and I were heavily involved in student politics, and at that time, there was a genocide going on in Darfur. The Janjaweed were killing Zagawa people and other Darfurian tribes, and a lot of students who were active in Jewish student politics, in particular, got involved. And I think I don't think it's cynical to say that one of the reasons that Jewish students got so heavily involved was they were pointing out a double standard with the treatment of Israel, that there was a genocide going on over here and the left-wing students weren't paying attention to it, but they were paying attention to, certain injustices that certainly were going on in and between Israel and the Palestinians. But I think it would be cynical to say that was the only reason. People really, really cared about. We really, really cared about this genocide, and we put a lot of effort into protesting, raising awareness, raising money, and there was one Darfuri refugee to England who had his asylum refused by the government because he had first touched ground in Spain before coming on to Britain. And Britain said he should have claimed asylum in Spain, and therefore Britain doesn't have a responsibility to accept his case. And they were going to deport him to Sudan, which at the time really would have been a death sentence to him. And thankfully, it did get sorted out eventually. The British equivalent of the Supreme Court at the time, Britain now has a Supreme Court, didn't then. The equivalent of the Supreme Court at the time eventually issued a ruling saying it was illegal to deport people to Darfuris to Sudan, and he was eventually given indefinite stay in Britain. Now, he had got himself in trouble because rather stupidly, given his tremendous fear of being deported, he filed another asylum application under a false name, the reason I say it was rather stupid is because they had his fingerprints, right? So it was very easy for them to see that, and he got sent to prison, and it was a nasty situation. And because we were heavily involved in student politics, we found out about his case because the people who ran something called the Aegis Trust that were heavily active in trying to lobby around these issues, they called me up, and I can't remember, it's me or Gabby, and said, there's this guy in prison. The authorities said they would let him out of prison as long as somebody would be his kind of trustee or guarantor or whatever it was, and that he'd sign in every day and he'd have to live with these people, but he wouldn't have to be in prison. And we offered to do it because it was actually a very easy thing to do, because we had a spare bed, we had a sofa bed and whatever, and we didn't have children, so we didn't feel like it would be, you know, whatever. We did it. And it was actually a very easy thing to do, and he lived with us for 6 months, and it was fine. There were some strange lessons that I drew from this. One was a lot of our Orthodox friends in the community, religious friends, thought we were really weird for doing this. And that struck me as unfortunate, because like, this shouldn't be like, for religious people, it shouldn't be weird. It should be like what you naturally do. But the other thing I think about a lot is how my wife and I would never do that today. And we wouldn't do it today because we've got kids, and taking a traumatized refugee from, you know, who had been tortured in the Sudan. You don't know him from Adam, and he's a man, and you know, and there are various kind of vulnerabilities that my wife might have felt, my kids might have felt. He's taking a stranger into the home. I wouldn't do that anymore, right? So I'm talking about, like, to what extent is your door open or closed? You know, and I'm not proud to tell you that I wouldn't do it anymore. I'm just you know, reporting to you. And I feel uncomfortable knowing that we have a spare bedroom right now while people are sleeping rough, you know. But on the other hand, you know, it's legitimate to protect your children. Yeah, you can't open your home without caution and due diligence. But I suppose what I was trying to showcase in this class, with the help of the midrashim, was that those of us who do have spare rooms and empty sofas at night, we should reflect upon the question as to what extent are we legitimately protecting ourselves with our doors, and to what extent are we using our doors, God forbid, to shut out the sound of those in need, right? Because the Parashah without the Midrash seems to suggest that if we don't have love for the people outside of our doors, then we probably don't really have love for anybody at all, apart from ourselves. And even though I suggest that this is a lesson that comes from the verses around Lot and his daughters and the doors, I also suggest that it's rendered more salient, and it's rendered harder to miss when it's brought into stark comparison with Avraham and the Petach, the opening with which the Parashah begins, the opening which the rabbis have magnified from 1 to 2 to 4, right? The openings of a tent for which the entire world was created. Okay, and with that, I'm done. We've got a couple of minutes if people want to raise any associations or issues or questions. Yes, Yael. Please unmute yourself. Yeah.
I just wanted to reflect on your last comments. I know of a synagogue that is building and expanding, and in their building, it's Ikar in Los Angeles, and in their building, they are including a place for homeless elderly people.
Wonderful.
That not only will be on their campus, but will be included in their community.
I'm so happy to hear about that. That is a model for a shul. That's what shuls should be, and it shouldn't be strange. So I'm really, really glad. I'm really glad to hear of that. Thank you. Okay. So I suppose thank you very much, Jennifer, and thank you for your insights about doors and associations therein. The womb's an interesting one to think about. It's true, and that's not, and it's often called a petach rather than a door. It's an opening. that the baby passes through.
Okay. Yeah, I got it from Safari. You've all taught me well, and I'm sure we can relate to that wonderfully personal story that you just told us about. I know very often I've had the same experience where I so want to help, but because I'm protecting my loved ones,
of course,
I can't.
Yes.
Do
but
it.
I'd suggest, so first of all, it's wonderful that a shul like Ikara can do that in a safer way, because it's not in people's homes, it's in a,
Right.
And it's a really lovely way to do it. But also I think what the Gemara is saying in Baba Batra is it's inevitable that sometimes you won't be able to help because you do have a prior responsibility, but just even to be sensitive, like so that you can still, you still register the fact there are people in need around you, and hopefully that will motivate us to join communities that take collective action, for example. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Have a good week.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Chaya and Noah. Thank you.
Thank you, Chaya and Noah. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we've got lots more classes this week, so please check those out. Sorry, I'll get you the URL. The website is 5783.drisha.org. We've got really fantastic classes. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next week.